The courtroom went dead silent. My mother's lawyer had just finished his opening statement, a beautiful performance about a concerned parent trying to save her reckless daughter from financial ruin. Then Judge Morrison asked to see my financial records. What happened next? His hands started shaking, the color drained from his face, and he said 5 words that made my mother's world collapse. "We need to talk, now." But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you how a woman who forgot I existed for 21 years decided she deserved everything my grandparents left me. My name is Caroline. I'm 30 years old, and 3 months ago, I watched my own parents try to convince a judge that I was too mentally unstable to manage my inheritance. They wanted it all: the houses, the investment accounts, the trust funds, everything my grandparents had carefully built and intentionally left to me. They thought they'd win. They had lawyers, fabricated evidence, and a story designed to make me look like an incompetent mess. What they didn't have was the truth. And when that judge finally saw what I was really worth, what I'd actually built with my life, my parents didn't just lose their case, they lost everything. This is that story. And if you've ever had family treat you like you're worthless until you have something they want, you'll want to hear every word. Drop a comment below and let me know if you've ever dealt with people who only showed up when there was money involved. I was 8 years old when my mother decided motherhood didn't fit her aesthetic. It wasn't dramatic, no screaming, no big confrontation. She just walked into my bedroom on a Wednesday afternoon with my little pink suitcase already packed and said, "Caroline, you're going to spend some time with Grandma and Grandpa. Won't that be fun?" I remember asking her how long. She didn't answer. She just smoothed down her silk blouse, checked her lipstick in my bedroom mirror, and told me to hurry up because she had a lunch reservation. That sometime turned into forever. My father? He was there physically, but not really. He'd nod along with whatever my mother said, sign whatever she put in front of him, and spend his days playing golf with men who pretended to respect him. When Mom decided I was too inconvenient for their new lifestyle, the one with expensive trips and adult dinner parties, he just shrugged and went along with it. So I moved into my grandparents' estate in Connecticut. And honestly, it saved my life. Their house sat on 14 acres of pristine land, the kind of old money property that whispered wealth instead of shouting it. Marble entryways, libraries with first edition books, oil paintings that belonged in museums. But what I remember most wasn't the luxury. It was the structure, the safety, the feeling that someone actually gave a damn whether I lived or died. My grandmother, Dorothy, ran that household like a general. There were rules for everything: how to set a table properly, which fork to use when, how to sit with your spine straight and your shoulders back. She'd correct my posture at least 10 times a day. "A strong spine supports a strong character, Caroline," she'd say. "Don't slouch through life." At 8 years old, I thought she was just strict. Looking back now, I realized she was teaching me how to survive in a world that would constantly try to diminish me. My grandfather William was different, warmer. He taught me about money the way other grandfathers teach their grandkids about baseball. We'd sit in his study on Sunday mornings, and he'd explain compound interest, investment portfolios, and market trends while we ate pancakes. "Money is a tool, Caroline," he'd tell me, pointing at his charts and graphs. "Most people think it's about having things. It's not. It's about having choices." I didn't understand what he meant then. I do now. My parents would show up occasionally: birthdays, Christmas, Thanksgiving if they didn't have somewhere better to be. My mother would arrive in whatever luxury car she was driving that year, wearing designer everything, carrying expensive gifts that felt more like obligations than affection. She'd hug me at arm's length, like she was afraid my childhood might be contagious, and tell elaborate stories about her fabulous life. The parties she'd attended, the important people she'd met, the exotic places she'd been, and then she'd leave. Always with a promise to visit soon. Always with that same empty smile. I stopped believing her around age 11. That's when I stopped waiting by the window on weekends, hoping she'd surprise me. That's when I started understanding that some people have children the way they buy accessories. Something to show off when it's convenient, something to put away when it's not. By the time I was 14, my parents enrolled me in Ashford Academy, an elite boarding school 2 hours away. My mother framed it as an opportunity. "The best families send their daughters to Ashford," she'd said, barely looking up from her phone. "You'll make important connections, network with the right people." What she meant was, "You'll be even further away, and I won't have to pretend to be a mother anymore." Ashford was beautiful in that sterile, expensive way. Pristine buildings, small classes, teachers who actually knew your name. But it was also filled with girls who'd grown up with the same emotional neglect I had. We were all products of parents who'd chosen their lifestyles over their children. We recognized each other instantly. The boarding school orphans with living parents. I threw myself into academics because it was safer than making friends. Numbers made sense. Equations had solutions. Unlike family relationships, math followed rules that actually worked. I graduated as valedictorian at 17. Harvard accepted me with a full academic scholarship, which my mother managed to take credit for at my graduation ceremony, despite showing up 35 minutes late and spending the whole time on her phone. "My daughter," she'd announced to anyone who'd listen, "is going to Harvard. Can you imagine? I'm so proud." She'd said it like she'd had anything to do with it, like she'd been there for the late-night study sessions, the stress, the work. She hadn't. She'd been busy living her best life while my grandparents raised her daughter for her. Harvard Business School was where I finally started becoming myself. All those conversations with Grandfather William clicked into place as I studied finance, economics, corporate strategy. I understood it instinctively because I'd been trained for it since childhood. I graduated summa cum laude. My mother sent flowers. The card was signed by her assistant. 3 days after graduation, I started at Morrison Financial Group, a prestigious firm in Boston. I'd earned the position myself, stellar grades, excellent internship reviews, and an interview where I'd researched not just the company but their recent deals, their competitors, and their market position. My boss later told me it was the most prepared interview he'd ever seen. Within 6 months, I was managing portfolios worth tens of millions. The work came naturally: pattern recognition, risk assessment, strategic planning, all the skills my grandparents had taught me, now packaged into a career that paid extremely well. At 26, I bought my first apartment. Nothing extravagant, but it was mine. I'd saved every penny myself, and when I signed those papers, I felt something I'd never experienced before: complete independence. My mother called 3 weeks later. She'd heard about the purchase through the family financial network. "Darling, your own place! How exciting!" Her voice had that artificial brightness that meant she wanted something. "It must have been so expensive, though. Did Grandpa William help with the down payment?" The assumption that I couldn't possibly achieve anything on my own was so perfectly typical, I almost laughed. "I saved for it, Mom. I have a job." Of course. I just meant, well, you're so young for such big financial decisions. Maybe I should look over the paperwork? Make sure everything's in order?" There it was, the first crack in the facade. The first hint that she was paying attention to my money. I should have seen what was coming. My grandmother Dorothy died on a cold October morning. The funeral was packed with Connecticut's elite, people who'd known her for decades, who'd attended her charity galas and benefited from her quiet generosity. They gave beautiful eulogies about her grace and elegance. What they couldn't capture was how she'd single-handedly taught me to stand up for myself in a world designed to knock women down. My grandfather William died 5 months later. The doctors called it heart failure. I called it what it really was: a broken heart. 49 years of marriage doesn't just end with medical terminology. The reading of their will happened in the same law office where they'd conducted business for 30 years. My parents showed up late, dressed in expensive black, wearing expressions of practiced grief. My mother had spent more time at their funerals than she'd spent at their house in the previous 5 years combined. The lawyer, Mr. Harrison, read the will in his measured, professional voice. And then he got to the important part. The entirety of the estate, including all properties, investment accounts, business holdings, and trusts, is to be transferred directly to our granddaughter, Caroline Elizabeth Bennett, with the explicit provision that these assets remain solely under her control. The silence was so complete, I could hear the antique clock ticking on the wall. My mother's face went completely white. "I'm sorry, what? Could you repeat that?" Mr. Harrison repeated it, word for word. No misunderstanding. My grandparents had left me everything: the Connecticut estate, the Boston penthouse, the summer home in Martha's Vineyard, investment accounts I hadn't even known about, controlling interest in several businesses. Everything. My mother's face cycled through several shades of pale before settling on a color that matched her foundation. There must be some mistake. William and Dorothy would never. They understood family structure, generational responsibility. Mr. Harrison adjusted his glasses. "Mrs. Bennett, your parents were quite explicit about their reasoning. They felt Caroline had demonstrated the maturity and capability to handle these responsibilities." What he didn't read aloud, but what I saw when he handed me the private letter, was this: "Caroline has shown more wisdom in her young life than some people show in a lifetime. She earned this through character, not circumstance. Protect it fiercely. The meeting ended with my mother demanding copies of everything, her voice tight with barely controlled rage. As we walked to the parking garage, she finally spoke. "This is temporary, Caroline. You're 26 years old. No one your age should manage this kind of money without oversight." I looked at my mother, really looked at her. For the first time in years, she wasn't concerned about me. She was furious that her parents had seen something in me that she'd never bothered to look for. "I'll be fine, Mom. Grandpa William trained me well." Her laugh was sharp and bitter. "We'll see about that." I should have known that wasn't the end. It was just the beginning. For exactly 18 months, my mother played the role of supportive parent with Oscar-worthy commitment. She called every week, sent thoughtful gifts for no reason, suggested we take a vacation together to reconnect properly. She acted like she actually cared. I should have known something was wrong the moment she started pretending to be a mother. The suggestions started small. "Have you thought about getting a financial advisor, sweetheart? Someone who really understands inherited wealth?" Then they escalated. "That apartment is lovely, Caroline, but don't you think you should upgrade to something more appropriate? Something that reflects your new position?" By month 15, she wasn't even being subtle anymore. "I've been thinking, darling. For tax purposes, it might be wise to put some of the inheritance in both our names. Estate planning is so complex. You want to make sure everything's protected." I documented everything. Every phone call, every suggestion, every gradual escalation. I'd learned from my grandparents that documentation was power. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning in April. I found my mother sitting in my apartment building's lobby, chatting with the concierge like they were old friends. "Surprise," she announced, as if showing up uninvited was delightful. I was in the neighborhood. "Let's have lunch." The lunch was at an expensive restaurant where she'd made reservations in advance. Not so spontaneous after all. She waited until after we'd ordered to launch into what she called a serious conversation about your financial situation. "Inherited wealth comes with responsibilities you're not equipped to handle alone, Caroline. The tax implications alone are staggering. I think it would be best if I helped you manage these assets. We could set up joint accounts, establish proper oversight." I cut into my salmon and didn't look up. Oversight according to who? According to family, darling. Family. The word coming from a woman who'd abandoned me at 8 years old was almost funny. "I'll think about it," I said. But I'd already decided what I was going to do. It was time to protect myself. What happened 3 weeks later changed everything. Drop a comment below if you've ever had someone try to manipulate you through fake concern. The letter arrived on a Thursday. Not from my mother directly, she was too smart for that. It came from Patterson, Williams & Associates, a law firm that specialized in what they delicately called family wealth disputes. I opened it standing in my kitchen, coffee in hand, expecting maybe a notice about estate taxes or something routine. Instead, I got the shock of my life. My parents were petitioning the court for conservatorship over my assets. They were claiming I was mentally incompetent to manage my inheritance. I read it 3 times. Each time it got worse. According to their petition, I was emotionally unstable, financially reckless, and susceptible to manipulation by people seeking to exploit my substantial wealth. I was, according to my own parents, too damaged to be trusted with my own money. The irony was so thick I could barely breathe. But the real knife in the back came from the supporting documents. They'd collected affidavits from people I barely remembered. Distant relatives claiming they were concerned about Caroline's welfare. Former boarding school acquaintances who apparently remembered me as troubled and isolated. Even our old housekeeper who supposedly witnessed my erratic behavior as a child. Every single statement was either completely fabricated or twisted beyond recognition. Yes, I'd been quiet as a child. Because I was surrounded by adults who treated me like an expensive obligation. Yes, I'd been focused on my studies. Because academic achievement was the only thing that earned any recognition in my family. But presented together in legal language, these observations painted a picture of someone who couldn't be trusted with her own life, let alone $8 million. The worst allegation was that I'd manipulated my elderly grandparents, isolated them from their loving daughter, and poisoned them against their own family for financial gain. It was such a complete inversion of reality that I actually laughed out loud. Then I started crying. My grandparents were 2 of the sharpest, most capable people I'd ever known. The idea that a child, or even a young adult, could manipulate them was absurd. They'd made their decisions based on decades of observation, not momentary influence. But the court wouldn't know that. The court would only see this carefully constructed narrative of concerned parents trying to protect their unstable daughter from financial disaster. I called Mr. Harrison immediately. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the phone. "I've been expecting this call," he said when I explained what had arrived. "Your grandparents anticipated this possibility." "What do you mean they anticipated it?" "Caroline, your grandparents were extremely intelligent people. They knew there was a strong possibility their decision to leave everything to you would be challenged. They prepared for it." 20 minutes later, I was sitting in his office, staring at documents I'd never seen before. Medical evaluations of my grandparents' mental state right up until their deaths, psychological assessments proving their competency, detailed financial records showing their careful decision-making process over several years. But the most interesting document was a thick folder labeled Caroline Bennett, Character Assessment and Competency Documentation. "Your grandfather compiled this over the past 5 years," Mr. Harrison explained. "Academic records, employment evaluations, financial management records, testimonials from your professors and supervisors. It's essentially a comprehensive dossier proving your competency and character." I flipped through pages of documentation I didn't even know existed. My Harvard transcripts, performance reviews from Morrison Financial, bank statements showing my careful savings patterns and responsible spending, letters from people I'd worked with describing my professionalism and capability. He'd known. My grandfather had known this might happen, and he'd prepared for it. "There's one more thing," Mr. Harrison said quietly, handing me an envelope. "He wanted you to have this if it ever came to this point." Inside was a handwritten letter from Grandfather William, dated 2 weeks before his death. "My dearest Caroline, if you're reading this, it means someone is trying to take away what you've earned through your character and capabilities. Don't let them. You are exactly the person we raised you to be, strong, intelligent, and fully capable of defending yourself. Use these tools we've left you, document everything, trust your instincts, and remember that the best defense is often a strong offense. Your grandmother and I chose you not because of blood, but because of who you are. We watched you grow from a wounded child into a remarkable woman. We watched you succeed on your own merit, without asking for help, without taking shortcuts. That's why you deserve this inheritance. You earned it long before we died. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. All my love, Grandpa William." I sat in Mr. Harrison's office and cried. Not from fear, from gratitude, and from determination. My parents wanted a war? Fine, I'd give them one. Mr. Harrison's strategy was methodical and absolutely ruthless. Over the next 6 weeks, we prepared for battle with the kind of thoroughness that would have made Grandfather William proud. Every document was organized, every witness statement verified, every piece of evidence cataloged with military precision. "Your parents' legal team is expecting you to fold under pressure," Mr. Harrison explained during one of our late-night strategy sessions. His corner office overlooked the Boston harbor, and I watched ships coming and going while we worked. "They're counting on you being overwhelmed, intimidated, willing to settle just to make it go away." I reviewed the latest batch of character witnesses we'd compiled. Former professors, colleagues from Morrison Financial, even my apartment building's property manager. All of them ready to testify that I was exactly the opposite of everything my parents' petition claimed. "What they don't realize," I said, highlighting another section in my employment reviews, "is that you don't get raised by Dorothy and William Bennett without learning how to fight properly." The discovery phase revealed exactly what I'd suspected, and a few things that genuinely shocked me. My parents' legal team had submitted financial records as evidence, supposedly proving my reckless spending patterns. But they'd made a crucial error. "Caroline, look at this," Mr. Harrison said, spreading bank statements across his conference table. "These are copies of transactions they submitted as evidence of your incompetence. But look at the dates." I leaned forward, studying the highlighted entries. Credit applications, account openings, loan applications, all bearing dates from when I was in college and graduate school, all supposedly authorized by me, all handled through accounts I'd never opened. My stomach dropped. "She's been using my name and social security number," I whispered. "For years." Mr. Harrison nodded grimly. "Your mother has been committing identity theft and financial fraud for at least 7 years that we can document. Possibly longer." But why would she submit this as evidence? Doesn't this prove she's the one who can't be trusted? That's exactly what I'm wondering, he said, adjusting his glasses. Either her legal team didn't review these documents carefully enough, or they assumed the court wouldn't notice the discrepancies. Both possibilities suggest they're getting overconfident. We spent the following week documenting every fraudulent transaction, every forged signature, every account opened without my knowledge or consent. The pattern was clear and damning. My mother had been systematically using my identity to access credit, open accounts, make financial decisions in my name, all while building a case that I was too incompetent to manage my own affairs. The beautiful irony, Mr. Harrison observed, is that by submitting these records as evidence of your incompetence, she's actually provided us with documented proof of her own criminal behavior. But the discovery that really changed everything came from an unexpected source. While reviewing the list of character witnesses my parents planned to call, I noticed a name I recognized. Patricia Montgomery, my grandmother's personal assistant for almost 15 years. I need to call Patricia, I told Mr. Harrison. If she's testifying for my mother, something's very wrong. Patricia knew my grandparents better than almost anyone. The phone call revealed the true scope of what we were dealing with. "Oh, Caroline," Patricia said, her voice heavy with relief when I called. "I've been hoping someone would contact me. I need you to know I never agreed to testify for your mother." "What do you mean?" "That law firm called me. They asked questions about your grandparents' final years. I told them the truth, how sharp Dorothy and William were right up until the end, how carefully they planned everything. But somehow my name ended up on their witness list anyway." "What exactly did you tell them?" "I told them about the precautions your grandparents took, the medical evaluations they had done specifically to document their mental competence, the multiple attorneys they consulted about estate planning, the months they spent researching legal requirements to make sure their will couldn't be contested." She paused, then continued with obvious reluctance. "I also told them about the private investigator." My heart stopped. "What private investigator?" "Your grandfather hired someone to investigate your mother's financial activities about 2 years before he died. He'd suspected for a while that she was accessing accounts using your name, but he needed proof. When the investigator confirmed it, that's when William really started preparing for this exact scenario." "Do you still have contact information for this investigator?" "Better than that. I have copies of his entire report. Your grandfather asked me to keep them safe in case they were ever needed. I think now qualifies, don't you?" 3 days later, I sat in Mr. Harrison's office reviewing the most comprehensive documentation of financial fraud I'd ever seen. The private investigator had traced my mother's activities back nearly a decade. Not just identity theft, but a pattern of financial manipulation that included forged powers of attorney, unauthorized account access, and what appeared to be systematic theft from elderly clients she'd worked with in various roles over the years. My mother wasn't just greedy. She was a career criminal who specialized in exploiting trust. "This changes everything," Mr. Harrison said, his voice carrying a note of satisfaction. "We're not just defending against a conservatorship petition anymore. We're in a position to file criminal charges. Won't that make this personal? Turn it into a family vendetta instead of a legal proceeding?" Mr. Harrison smiled, the first time I'd seen him smile since this nightmare began. "Caroline, this was always personal. Your mother made it personal when she decided to try to steal your inheritance through the court system. The only difference now is that we have the ammunition to make her regret that decision. If you've ever discovered that someone you trusted was betraying you behind your back, drop a comment. Because what happened in that courtroom made my mother's betrayal public record." The courtroom was packed. Judge Harrison Mitchell, no relation to my lawyer, had a reputation for running his courtroom like a military operation. Punctual, professional, and completely intolerant of legal games. At 68, he'd seen every type of family dispute imaginable. His weathered face suggested he'd developed little patience for manufactured drama, which made my mother's choice to wear her grieving, concerned mother costume, complete with understated makeup that somehow highlighted her worry lines, seem particularly miscalculated. My father sat beside her, looking uncomfortable in his expensive suit. He'd barely spoken to me in years, but apparently he was willing to show up when there was money involved. Their lawyer, a slick attorney named Patterson, stood to give his opening statement. "Your Honor, we're here today because loving parents are concerned about their daughter's ability to manage a substantial inheritance responsibly." His voice dripped with practiced sympathy. "Mrs. and Mr. Bennett have observed behavior patterns suggesting Caroline may not be equipped to handle these financial responsibilities without proper oversight." I watched Judge Mitchell's expression carefully. His face remained neutral, but his eyes were sharp and attentive. This wasn't someone who'd be swayed by theatrical performances. Patterson continued, gesturing toward stacks of financial documents. Caroline Bennett inherited approximately $8 million in assets when her grandparents passed away 18 months ago. Since then, she has made numerous questionable decisions without consulting family members or seeking appropriate professional guidance. We're not asking the court to remove these assets from Caroline. We're simply requesting that proper oversight be established to protect both her interests and her future. The words were carefully chosen to sound reasonable, protective rather than predatory. If I hadn't known the truth about my parents' motivations, I might have found the argument compelling. Then Mr. Harrison stood for his opening statement. His was notably shorter and more direct. Your Honor, this is not a case about protecting a vulnerable young woman from poor financial decisions. This is a case about estranged parents attempting to gain legal control over assets they believe they should have inherited themselves. He paused, letting that sink in. The evidence will show that Caroline Bennett is not only competent to manage her inheritance, but has demonstrated remarkable financial acumen since receiving it. More importantly, the evidence will reveal that the petitioners have been engaging in systematic financial fraud using their daughter's identity for nearly a decade. That got Judge Mitchell's attention. He leaned forward slightly, his focus sharpening. Furthermore, Mr. Harrison continued, we will demonstrate that by filing this petition and submitting certain financial records as evidence, the petitioners have inadvertently provided documentation of their own criminal activities. My mother's face went completely white. Apparently, her legal team hadn't warned her we might take this approach. Mr. Harrison, Judge Mitchell said carefully, those are serious allegations. I trust you have substantial evidence to support them? Extensive evidence, Your Honor, including documentation compiled by a private investigator hired by the deceased grandparents specifically to investigate these activities. Patterson was on his feet immediately. Objection, Your Honor. This is highly prejudicial and… Overruled, Judge Mitchell interrupted. Mr. Patterson, your clients filed this petition claiming incompetence and requesting access to substantial assets. Mr. Harrison is entitled to present evidence regarding his client's competency and the motivations behind this legal action. Continue, Mr. Harrison. The first day of testimony proceeded exactly as we'd planned. Patterson called his character witnesses, people who claimed to remember me as withdrawn and difficult during my teenage years. Their testimony was weak and obviously coached, consisting mainly of vague observations about my personality, rather than any concrete evidence of incompetence. More damaging were the financial experts Patterson had hired to analyze my spending patterns. Dr. Richard Hoffman, an economics professor, testified that I'd purchased a $70,000 vehicle within 6 months of inheriting, that I'd made large charitable donations, that I'd invested in what appeared to be speculative technology stocks. These patterns, he said with authority, suggest someone who lacks the emotional maturity to handle substantial wealth responsibly. It sounded convincing, until Mr. Harrison began his cross-examination. Dr. Hoffman, did you research the specific vehicle Ms. Bennett purchased? Well, the amount seemed excessive for someone her age. The vehicle was a certified pre-owned Tesla Model S with exceptional safety ratings and minimal depreciation, purchased after 3 months of research and comparison shopping. Are you suggesting that purchasing a reliable, environmentally conscious vehicle is evidence of incompetence? Dr. Hoffman shifted uncomfortably. Not specifically, but the amount. Did you examine the charitable organizations Ms. Bennett chose to support? The amount seemed large relative to her age and experience. Organizations that provide educational scholarships for underprivileged students and support elder care facilities. The same types of causes her grandparents had supported for decades. Does continuing her family's philanthropic traditions indicate incompetence? By the time Mr. Harrison finished, it was clear that every financial decision I'd made had been carefully researched and strategically sound. What Patterson had tried to present as evidence of poor judgment actually demonstrated exactly the opposite. But the real turning point came when Patterson called his final witness, my mother. She took the stand wearing a navy blue suit that projected maternal authority. Her voice was steady and concerned as she described her growing worry about my ability to handle the inheritance responsibly. I've tried to offer guidance, she said, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. But Caroline has become increasingly isolated, defensive about any suggestion that she might benefit from help or advice. This isn't about money, Your Honor. This is about making sure my daughter doesn't make decisions she'll regret for the rest of her life. It was a masterful performance. I could see at least one person in the gallery nodding sympathetically. Then Mr. Harrison stood up for cross-examination, and everything changed. Mrs. Bennet, Mr. Harrison began, his voice pleasant and conversational. You've testified that you're concerned about your daughter's financial decision-making. When did this concern begin? My mother maintained her composed motherly demeanor. It's been growing gradually, probably starting around the time she inherited from my parents. I see. And before that inheritance, how often were you in contact with Caroline? A slight pause. We spoke regularly. How regularly? Weekly? Monthly? It varied depending on our schedules. Mr. Harrison approached the witness stand, holding a thick folder. Mrs. Bennet, I have phone records from Caroline's cellular provider covering the 5 years before her grandparents' deaths. According to these records, you called your daughter exactly 19 times during that entire 5-year period. The longest conversation lasted 6 minutes and 14 seconds. Does that sound like regular contact to you? My mother's composure flickered. Phone records don't show the full picture of a family relationship. You're absolutely right. Let's talk about in-person visits. During those same 5 years, how many times did you visit Caroline at college or at her apartment? That's difficult to quantify exactly. Would you say it was more than 10 times? More than 5? Even 3? The silence stretched uncomfortably long. Mrs. Bennet, please answer the question. Our family doesn't express affection through constant visits and phone calls, my mother said, her voice developing a defensive edge. We believe in independence, in allowing young adults to develop their own lives. Yet now you're asking this court to remove that independence entirely, Mr. Harrison observed. Interesting shift in philosophy. Let's move on to your financial concerns about Caroline's inheritance management. You've testified that she's making poor decisions without consulting family members. When exactly did she consult you about financial matters before the inheritance? We discussed her college choices, her career path. I'm specifically asking about financial consultation. Did Caroline ever ask you for money? Did she ever seek your advice about investments or major purchases? No, but, in fact, isn't it true that Caroline has been completely financially independent since college graduation and has never asked you for any form of financial support? That's not the point. What is the point, Mrs. Bennet? Why is a woman who has been completely self-sufficient for years suddenly in need of your financial oversight? My mother's face was beginning to flush, the careful makeup not quite concealing her growing agitation. $8 million is a significant amount of money. Anyone would benefit from proper guidance. Let's talk about proper guidance, Mr. Harrison said, his tone sharpening. Are you familiar with an account at First National Bank opened in Caroline's name in March of 2019? The color drained from my mother's face so quickly, I thought she might actually faint. I don't know what you're referring to. Let me refresh your memory. Mr. Harrison pulled out a bank statement and handed it to her. This is a credit card application filed in Caroline's name while she was attending classes in Boston. The application was filed from your address in Connecticut and uses your handwriting. Can you explain how that happened? Patterson was on his feet immediately. Objection, Your Honor. This is outside the scope of this proceeding. Your Honor, Mr. Harrison replied calmly. The petitioners have asked this court to determine whether Caroline Bennet is competent to manage her finances. Evidence of fraudulent activity using her identity is directly relevant to both her competency and the motivations behind this petition. Overruled, Judge Mitchell said. Mrs. Bennet, please answer the question. My mother stared at the document, her hands visibly shaking. There must be some mistake. Mrs. Bennet, I have 16 similar documents spanning 8 years. Credit applications, bank account openings, loan applications, all filed in your daughter's name, all from your address, all in your handwriting. Would you like to explain these mistakes? The courtroom was dead silent. I could see Patterson frantically scribbling notes, probably trying to figure out how to minimize the damage. Judge Mitchell leaned forward, his expression no longer neutral, but deeply concerned. I was trying to help her build credit, my mother began weakly. Without her knowledge or consent? I had power of attorney. Please show the court this power of attorney document. Another long pause. It wasn't formal, but as her mother, Mrs. Bennet, Mr. Harrison interrupted. There is no such thing as informal power of attorney. Either you had legal authorization to act on your daughter's behalf, or you were committing fraud. Which was it? Patterson tried another objection, but Judge Mitchell waved him off. The judge was now studying my mother with the kind of attention that suggested he'd moved from interested observer to active investigator. "Let's move on to something else," Mr. Harrison continued relentlessly. "You testified that you're concerned about Caroline's isolation from family. When did you last attempt to maintain a relationship with her outside of financial matters?" "We've always had a close relationship. Mrs. Bennett, when is Caroline's birthday?" The question seemed to come from nowhere. My mother's eyes went wide with panic. "Her birthday? It's in the spring. What date?" "Your Honor, I don't see how." "This is a simple question about basic family knowledge," Mr. Harrison said. "If Mrs. Bennett is genuinely concerned about her daughter's welfare, surely she knows when her daughter was born." Judge Mitchell nodded grimly. "Answer the question, Mrs. Bennett." My mother's voice was barely audible. "April something. I'd have to check my calendar." "April 15th, Mr. Harrison said matter-of-factly. "Caroline's birthday is April 15th. She turned 30 years old 6 weeks ago. You didn't call. You didn't send a card. You didn't acknowledge it at all." He paused, letting that sink in throughout the courtroom. "Mrs. Bennett, you don't know your daughter's birthday. You've had minimal contact with her for years. You've never provided financial support or guidance. You abandoned her when she was 8 years old. Yet you're asking this court to believe that you're suddenly concerned about her welfare, enough to take control of $8 million in assets. Isn't it more accurate to say that you're upset you weren't included in your parents' will, and you're using this court proceeding to try to gain access to money you feel entitled to?" "That's not true," my mother snapped, her careful composure finally cracking completely. "That money should have come to me. I'm their daughter. Caroline manipulated them. She turned them against their own child, isolated them, and filled their heads with lies about me." The outburst was so sudden and so venomous that several people in the gallery actually gasped. Patterson was trying desperately to signal her to stop talking, but my mother was past caring about legal strategy. "I'm their family," she continued, her voice rising. "I'm blood, not some ungrateful little girl who couldn't even be bothered to visit them unless she wanted something. She turned them against me, made them think I was some kind of failure. And now she gets everything while I get nothing? That's not how families are supposed to work." "Mrs. Bennett, that's enough." Judge Mitchell's gavel came down hard, but my mother wasn't finished. Years of resentment and entitlement were pouring out in a torrent of self-pity and accusation. "Do you know what it's like to have your own parents choose a grandchild over their daughter? To spend your entire life trying to live up to their impossible standards, only to watch them hand everything to someone who never had to work for anything?" "Your Honor," Mr. Harrison said quietly, "I believe the petitioner has just provided the court with her true motivation for this proceeding." Judge Mitchell looked like someone had offered him something deeply unpleasant. "Indeed, she has. Mrs. Bennett, please step down." The atmosphere in the courtroom the following morning was completely different. Word had spread about my mother's meltdown. The gallery was packed with reporters, legal observers, and several people from the financial community who'd known my grandparents. Judge Mitchell entered with an expression that suggested he'd spent the evening reviewing case law and wasn't pleased with what he'd found. "Before we continue," he announced, "I want to address the allegations that emerged during yesterday's testimony. Mr. Harrison, you've alleged systematic identity theft and fraud. These are serious criminal matters that may require referral to appropriate authorities. I want to understand the full scope of what we're dealing with." Mr. Harrison stood, carrying several thick folders. "Your Honor, with the court's permission, I'd like to call Patricia Montgomery as a witness." Patricia took the stand wearing a simple gray suit, her silver hair pulled back in a neat bun. At 63, she had the bearing of someone who'd spent decades managing complex affairs for demanding employers. Her testimony was methodical and devastating. Mr. and Mrs. Bennett began taking specific legal precautions approximately 3 years before their deaths, she explained in her precise professional voice. They had regular competency evaluations performed by multiple physicians. They consulted with several estate planning attorneys, and in their final year, they hired a private investigator to document certain financial irregularities they'd discovered. "What kind of irregularities?" Mr. Harrison asked. "Unauthorized credit accounts opened in Caroline's name, loan applications filed without her knowledge, several instances where Mrs. Bennett had attempted to access accounts using Caroline's social security number and personal information." Patterson objected strenuously, but Judge Mitchell allowed the testimony to continue. "The private investigator's report," Patricia explained, "had documented not just the identity theft involving me, but a pattern of financial manipulation that extended to several elderly clients my mother had worked with over the years. Mr. Bennett was particularly concerned," Patricia continued. He said he'd seen this pattern before in business, people using family relationships or positions of trust to gain access to assets that weren't legally theirs. He was determined to protect Caroline from any attempt to manipulate her inheritance. Then came the bombshell. In their final months, Mr. and Mrs. Bennet established what they called a fraud protection protocol. They created detailed documentation not just of their decision-making process, but of every interaction they'd had with family members regarding estate planning. She paused, glancing at me. They also recorded several conversations with Mrs. Bennet, where she made it clear she expected to inherit everything. Recorded conversations? Judge Mitchell asked sharply. Yes, Your Honor. Audio recordings made with Mrs. Bennet's knowledge and consent during family meetings about estate planning. Mr. Bennet was very careful about the legal requirements. My heart stopped. My grandparents had recorded my mother's conversations. Mr. Harrison approached the witness stand with a small digital device. Ms. Montgomery, I'm showing you what's been marked as Exhibit A47. Can you identify this? It's one of the audio recordings Mr. Bennet made during a family meeting approximately 8 months before his death. Mrs. Bennet had come to discuss estate planning, and Mr. Bennet wanted documentation of exactly what was said. With the court's permission, I'd like to play a brief excerpt. Judge Mitchell nodded. And suddenly, my mother's voice filled the courtroom. Not the careful, concerned tone she'd used in her testimony, but her real voice, sharp with entitlement and barely controlled anger. William, this is ridiculous. You cannot seriously be considering leaving everything to Caroline. She's 26 years old. What does she know about managing this kind of wealth? This kind of responsibility? My grandfather's voice was calm and measured in response. Caroline has demonstrated excellent judgment in every aspect of her life. Her academic achievements, her professional success, her personal character, all suggest she's exactly the kind of person who should be trusted with family assets. Personal character? My mother's laugh was harsh and dismissive. She's barely part of this family. When does she visit? When does she call? She shows up for holidays and acts like she belongs here. But where was she when you needed her? When Dorothy was sick, Caroline was here every weekend for 6 months, my grandfather replied firmly. She took leave from her job to help with medical appointments. She researched treatment options and coordinated with doctors. Where were you, Sandra? The silence on the recording stretched uncomfortably long. That's different, my mother finally said. I have my own life, my own responsibilities. But this inheritance, this is family money, Bennet family money. It should stay in the family. Caroline is family. She's a grandchild. The inheritance should go to your children first, then to grandchildren. That's how these things work. That's how proper families handle wealth transfer. Proper families, my grandfather said quietly, make decisions based on character and capability, not just bloodlines. This conversation is over, Sandra. The recording ended, leaving the courtroom in absolute silence. Patterson was on his feet immediately. Your Honor, this recording is highly prejudicial and taken out of context. Mr. Patterson, Judge Mitchell interrupted, his voice cold with displeasure. Your client just spent 2 days testifying that she's concerned about Caroline's welfare and wants to protect family interests. This recording suggests her real motivation is anger about not inheriting assets she felt entitled to. How exactly is that taken out of context? There was no good answer to that question. Mr. Harrison played 2 more recordings, each one more damaging than the last. My mother accusing me of manipulation. My mother calling my career a waste. My mother explicitly stating that she intended to challenge any will that didn't include her as the primary beneficiary. By the time the recordings ended, my mother was staring at the floor, her face completely drained of color. Judge Mitchell leaned back in his chair. Mr. Patterson, does your client wish to withdraw this petition? Patterson whispered urgently with my parents for several minutes before responding. No, Your Honor. We maintain that regardless of Mrs. Bennet's motivations, Caroline still requires proper oversight for such substantial assets. It was a desperate attempt to salvage something from the wreckage. Judge Mitchell's expression suggested it was far too late for that strategy. Very well, he said. Mr. Harrison, do you have additional evidence regarding Caroline's competency? Just one more witness, Your Honor. I'd like to call Caroline Bennet herself. Taking the witness stand felt surreal. Like stepping into a spotlight I'd never wanted to defend capabilities I'd never thought I'd need to prove. Mr. Harrison's questions were straightforward, designed to let me tell my own story. Caroline, you inherited approximately $8 million 18 months ago. Can you tell the court what you've done with that inheritance? I'd prepared for this moment. I've maintained the existing investment structure my grandparents established, which was already performing well. I've made some adjustments to increase diversification and reduce risk exposure, but nothing dramatic or speculative. Can you give the court specific examples? Certainly. I moved approximately 15% of the equity holdings into more conservative bond funds and treasury securities. I established a separate charitable giving fund that mirrors my grandparents' philanthropic interests. I've set aside funds for ongoing property maintenance and taxes on the various real estate holdings. Have you made any major purchases? I bought a vehicle to replace my college car, which was becoming unreliable. I upgraded my apartment to something more appropriate for my income level, though I kept the investment conservative. And I've continued my grandparents' tradition of supporting educational scholarships. Nothing sounds particularly reckless or incompetent about those decisions. Can you tell the court about your professional background? This was where I felt most confident. I graduated summa cum laude from Harvard Business School. I've worked at Morrison Financial Group for 4 years. I currently manage portfolios for 14 high-net-worth clients with combined assets of approximately $52 million. My performance reviews have been consistently excellent. I've never had a client complaint or regulatory issue. Caroline, your mother has testified that you've isolated yourself from family and made these financial decisions without consulting anyone. Is that accurate? I glanced at my mother sitting at the plaintiff's table, her arms crossed, her jaw set in a hard line. I consulted with the same financial advisors my grandparents used. I worked with their estate attorney to ensure all transfers were handled properly. I've maintained relationships with several of their longtime business associates who knew their investment philosophy. The only family members I didn't consult were my parents, because they'd never shown interest in my financial decisions before. And frankly, I didn't trust their motivations. Can you explain what you mean by that? This was the moment I'd been both dreading and anticipating, the chance to finally tell the truth about our family dynamic without worrying about being diplomatic. My mother abandoned me when I was 8 years old, I said, my voice steady despite the emotional weight of the words. She left me with my grandparents and built a life that didn't include regular contact with her daughter. For 22 years, she treated me like an obligation she had to acknowledge occasionally, rather than a child she wanted in her life. I could see several people in the gallery nodding. When my grandparents died and left me their estate, suddenly my mother developed an intense interest in my welfare and my financial decisions. This wasn't maternal concern. This was anger that she hadn't inherited money she felt entitled to, combined with an opportunity to gain control over assets through legal manipulation. Patterson stood to object, but Judge Mitchell waved him down. The witness may continue. Your Honor, my mother didn't even know my birthday when she testified yesterday. She can't name my college major, my employer, or any of my professional achievements. She's never visited my apartment, never met any of my friends, couldn't tell you basic facts about my life. Yet she's asking this court to believe she's qualified to make decisions about my financial future. I pulled out a folder I'd prepared specifically for this moment. I brought documentation to prove my competency, but honestly, I think the burden of proof should be reversed. Anyone seeking to remove legal rights from another adult should have to prove extraordinary circumstances justify that action. My parents haven't even proven they know me well enough to make those judgments. Caroline, Mr. Harrison said gently, if this court grants your parents conservatorship over your assets, what do you believe will happen? I believe they'll systematically drain the accounts for their own benefit, just like my mother's been doing with my identity for years through fraudulent credit applications and unauthorized account access. The difference is that this time it would be legal, because the court will have given them permission to control my finances. One final question. Do you want a relationship with your parents? The question caught me off guard, and I felt tears welling up despite my determination to remain composed. I wanted that relationship for 30 years, I said quietly. I kept hoping they'd decide I was worth their time and attention, but I've learned that you can't force people to love you, and you can't build real relationships on manipulation and financial control. I paused, looking directly at my mother for the first time since taking the stand. If my parents wanted to be part of my life, they could have called me on my birthday. They could have visited my apartment. They could have asked about my career, or my interests, or anything about who I am as a person. Instead, they hired lawyers to try to take my inheritance. That tells me everything I need to know about their priorities. When I finished testifying, the courtroom was completely silent. Patterson chose not to cross-examine me. Then Judge Mitchell did something unexpected. Mr. Harrison, he said, you've presented extensive evidence of Ms. Bennett's competency. but I'd like to see the current state of her financial affairs. Do you have updated portfolio statements? Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Harrison approached with a folder. Judge Mitchell opened it, and his expression changed completely. He flipped through several pages, his eyes widening. Then he looked at me with something that looked like shock. Ms. Bennett, he said slowly, according to these statements, you inherited approximately $8 million 18 months ago. Is that correct? Yes, Your Honor, and your current net worth, including all assets and investments, is. He paused, looking at the number again as if to confirm he was reading it correctly. Approximately $14.2 million? The courtroom erupted. My parents' faces went completely white. My mother actually grabbed the table for support. You've increased your inheritance by over 75% in 18 months? Judge Mitchell asked. Yes, Your Honor. I made several strategic investments that performed well. I also continued working and saved my entire salary, which was substantial. My grandparents taught me that wealth should grow, not stagnate. Judge Mitchell looked at my parents with an expression of absolute disgust. So, let me understand this correctly, he said, his voice cutting through the courtroom noise. You're asking this court to grant you conservatorship over a woman who has not only managed her inheritance responsibly, but has grown it by over $6 million while maintaining a successful career and demonstrating impeccable financial judgment? Patterson tried to respond, but Judge Mitchell held up his hand. Mr. and Mrs. Bennett, please stand. My parents stood, both looking like they might be sick. I've presided over family court proceedings for 24 years, Judge Mitchell began. I've seen every type of family dispute imaginable: custody battles, inheritance fights, competency hearings involving genuinely impaired individuals who needed protection. This case is unlike anything I've encountered. He looked directly at my mother. Mrs. Bennett, you have presented this court with a petition claiming your daughter is incompetent to manage her inheritance. The evidence presented during this hearing proves exactly the opposite. Caroline Bennett is not only competent to manage her assets, but has demonstrated exceptional judgment, professional expertise, and financial acumen that exceeds most people with decades more experience. He paused, consulting his notes. More troubling, however, is the evidence that your petition was motivated not by concern for your daughter's welfare, but by your own anger about being excluded from your parents' will. The court has heard audio recordings of conversations where you explicitly stated your belief that you should have inherited these assets, and your intention to challenge any will that didn't benefit you directly. Patterson started to rise, but Judge Mitchell's expression stopped him. I'm not finished. The court has also heard extensive testimony about fraudulent financial activities conducted in your daughter's name over a period of several years. Credit accounts opened without her knowledge, loan applications filed using her personal information, systematic identity theft that continued even as you were preparing to file this competency petition. My mother's face had gone completely white. My father looked like he wanted to disappear. Mrs. Bennett, by submitting financial records as evidence in this proceeding, you have inadvertently provided documentation of your own criminal activities. The court is therefore taking several actions today. Judge Mitchell's voice grew stronger, more decisive. First, the petition for conservatorship is denied in its entirety. Caroline Bennett has full legal capacity to manage her assets, and this court finds no evidence whatsoever to justify removing that capacity. In fact, the evidence suggests she should be teaching classes on financial management. I felt a wave of relief so intense I almost started crying. Second, all financial records and documentation submitted during this proceeding will be forwarded to the State Attorney General's office for investigation of potential criminal fraud charges. The evidence suggests a pattern of identity theft and financial manipulation that extends beyond this family dispute and may constitute criminal enterprise. My mother made a sound like a wounded animal. My father had gone gray. Third, given the frivolous and malicious nature of this petition and the apparent bad faith motivations behind it, Mr. and Mrs. Bennett will be responsible for all court costs and reasonable attorney fees incurred by the defendant. Based on the documentation I've reviewed, that amount will be substantial. But Judge Mitchell wasn't finished. Finally, I want to address something that troubles me deeply about this entire proceeding. Mrs. Bennett, you abandoned your daughter when she was 8 years old. You maintained minimal contact with her throughout her childhood and young adulthood. You never provided financial support, guidance, or meaningful parental involvement in her life. You didn't even know her birthday. His voice grew harder, more condemning. Yet, when she inherited assets from the grandparents who actually raised her, you suddenly developed intense concern for her welfare. This court finds that behavior not just hypocritical, but morally reprehensible. You are not entitled to control or benefit from assets you did nothing to help create, manage, or preserve. Your daughter earned this inheritance through her character and capabilities. You have no claim to it whatsoever. My mother was crying now, but they weren't tears of remorse. They were tears of rage and humiliation that her plan had failed so spectacularly. Judge Mitchell stood, and the entire courtroom rose with him. "Ms. Bennett," he said, addressing me directly, "you have demonstrated remarkable grace and dignity throughout this ordeal. Your grandparents chose their heir wisely. This court wishes you continued success in managing your inheritance and building the life you deserve, free from interference from people who have never had your best interests at heart." He looked one final time at my parents. "This case is closed. We're adjourned." As the gavel came down, I heard my mother let out a sob. Not of sadness, of fury. The aftermath was swift and devastating, for my parents. Within a week, the State Attorney General's office opened a formal investigation into my mother's financial activities. Within a month, they'd filed criminal charges for identity theft, fraud, and financial exploitation of elderly clients. My mother eventually pleaded guilty to avoid a lengthy trial. She received 4 years of supervised probation, substantial restitution requirements, and a permanent mark on her record that would follow her forever. My father, who'd been complicit in the conservatorship attempt, found himself socially ostracized. Their country club memberships were revoked. Their friends stopped calling. The community that had once embraced them turned its back completely. I never heard from either of them again. No apology, no explanation, no acknowledgement of what they'd tried to do. And honestly, I was fine with that. The inheritance, now grown to over $14 million, allowed me to start my own financial planning firm. I specialize in helping families navigate complex wealth transfer issues without destroying their relationships in the process. It's deeply satisfying work. Helping people avoid the mistakes my family made. Ensuring that financial decisions are based on merit and character rather than manipulation and entitlement. I also established a scholarship fund in my grandparents' names. Every year it provides full-ride scholarships to students who've overcome family abandonment or dysfunction to achieve academic excellence. Students like I was. Young people who need to know that their worth isn't determined by their parents' failures. The Connecticut estate is now a retreat center for those scholarship recipients. A place where kids who've been told they're not good enough can see that they absolutely are. My grandparents would have loved that. Sometimes people ask me if I regret how things turned out with my parents. If I wish we could have found a way to reconcile, the answer is no, because they showed me exactly who they were. They showed me that I was never a daughter to them. I was a missed opportunity, a walking trust fund they felt entitled to access. And when I wouldn't give them what they wanted, they tried to take it by force. You can't build relationships on that foundation. And I'm not interested in trying. The best thing I ever learned from my grandparents wasn't about money or investments or financial planning. It was this: sometimes the family you're born into isn't your real family. Your real family is the people who show up, the people who invest in you, the people who believe in your potential and help you become who you're meant to be. My parents gave me life, but my grandparents gave me everything else. And that inheritance, the real one, the one that can't be measured in dollars, is worth more than any bank account could ever hold. If this story resonated with you, drop a comment below. Share your thoughts about family, loyalty, and what we really owe the people who share our DNA but nothing else. Because sometimes the bravest thing you can do is walk away from toxic people, even when they're blood. And to anyone out there dealing with family members who only value you for what they can take from you, remember this: your worth isn't determined by their greed. Your inheritance isn't just money. It's the character you build, the integrity you maintain, and the life you create on your own terms. They can't take that from you, no matter how hard they try.